Okay, welcome back, everybody, to another contextualized reading of Shakespeare. My name is Roger Green. This is the first time that you're seeing this, I've done a number of these contextualized reading lectures for my university students, but also for the general public. I call them contextualized readings rather than formal lectures because they're meant for people who are making their way through the plays. So I'm walking through act by act, and then adding context, and the contexts are sometimes historical, sometimes literary critical. And so I'm going to bust through Act 5 of Hamlet today rather quickly, and then I'm going to end. And this is partly because some of my students this semester, this summer semester, have said that they would like a little bit of specific attention both to gendered or feminist readings of Ophelia and also to psychoanalysis. And I've touched on some of that in earlier lectures already, but I will be a little bit more specific in the end, just kind of some follow-up remarks to the play itself. So let me just walk through Act 5. It's fairly short, but like all of Hamlet, I could do an entire semester just on this play. And so we get, I think it's important that they're called clowns in the text, right? The grave diggers here are called clowns. But this is also a reference to rural folk as well. And what we get here, and I think you might want to compare it maybe with the underplot of A Midsummer Night's Dream, is that we get another clear instance in Shakespeare where he is dealing as a writer with various different classes of society. And I think that first of all, it speaks to, a great deal of insight for Shakespeare as a writer, but it also allows him to poke fun of his own society, to do a little bit of satire. And we've talked about satire a bit throughout the Shakespeare or the Hamlet lectures, especially with the war of the poets, right? Or the controversy among the young boy players in London that's happening, that's being commented on earlier in the play. But here's a pretty clear instance where you have these clowns and they're digging Ophelia's grave. And the first clown says, if this had not been a gentlewoman, she should have been buried out of Christian burial. So on top of the class insight here, what I want you to pay attention to, because I've mentioned this in a number of my contextualized readings, is the Euro-Christian atmosphere of this. I think that humanists and humanist readings of the play tend to try and universalize Shakespeare as a humanist, and they do that by assuming that sort of secularism, in a Western liberal sense, is this trajectory that applies to everybody around the world, and it takes for granted the fact that the world is already Euro-Christian. So it just says, okay, well, we could take Hamlet and drop it into India. We could drop it into Asia. And in fact, it's really funny if you ever get a chance to read, I won't have time to comment on it today, Aldous Huxley's last book, Island, which deals with playing of the play Hamlet in a kind of a fictional island that he sets in the Indian Ocean, where there's a kind of overcoming of tragedy, and it makes us have to rethink what tragedy is. Brilliant work of Aldous Huxley's in general. But yes, there's so as you hear me talk today, think about the things that, if you're not a Christian, that don't make sense. And even the things, if you don't, and I'm not talking about Christian in the sense of a believing, I went to confess, I was confirmed and I go to confession like a devout Christian in any sort of way. I'm thinking about Euro-Christian in all lowercase, one word, Euro-Christian worldview, right? So that when Cain and Abel, for example, are just sort of mentioned off the cuff, people of Euro-Christian culture know that what's being referenced is these brothers that are in the Old Testament of the Bible. And yes, of course, they're in the Tanakh or the Jewish Bible. But Shakespeare is writing in the Euro-Christian context, right? And so we're receiving them in the Euro-Christian context here. We're not receiving them, these figures from the so-called Old Testament through, say, Talmudic readings, for example, right? So Talmudic culture, Jewish culture, will have its own sort of renditions and thinking about this stuff, and oftentimes it has quite surprising to people of Euro-Christian culture what some of the traditional Jewish readings of figures from the Bible are. So Euro-Christian is not really here about what faith you believe in, and it doesn't apply to atheists, to people who say, well, I reject it anyway, because when you reject the frame still persists. So you say, oh, you believe in this thing called God, and I reject it by saying I disbelieve in that, but that still acknowledges the frame of the Euro-Christian God, right? So culturally speaking, avowed atheists are still Euro-Christians. And if you want, you can look up Tink Tinker's wonderful piece. It's called What Are We Going to Do with White People? You can look it up on thenewpolis.com for a Native American explanation of the Euro-Christian term. And Tink is one of my colleagues, and I follow him in using that terminology. So let's keep going here. So why wouldn't Ophelia get a Christian burial? Some of you probably have already figured this out. Because she's suspected of having committed suicide. No, notice that the text is that she is suspected of having committed suicide. I think most readings just generally accept that she has committed suicide. There is a recent film called Ophelia that takes substantial liberties with Shakespeare's text, and so I don't want to highlight it too much. It would do well in a Shakespeare and popular culture class, but maybe not so much in our essential Shakespeare class this summer. But Shakespeare and popular culture, or Hamlet and as derivatives or something like that. I think that the recent Ophelia feature film, there's also a short film called Ophelia that deals with Hamlet being a boxer. But in the feature-length film, presents itself as a kind of feminist reading of Ophelia. I feel like it is not quite feminist. In fact, it kind of presents Ophelia in very bourgeois, middle class types of readings of feminism, and in some ways reads her, especially at the end, more like a traditional liberal man than as a woman. But that maybe email me for more commentary on that. So in Euro-Christian culture of the time period, someone who was suspected of suicide or who had committed suicide could not receive a Christian burial because he or she would have committed a mortal sin, the mortal sin of murder, self-murder, right? Hamlet commented on it in his first soliloquy, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter, right? That God had not said that I can't commit suicide. The second clown here says, why, there thou sayest, and the more the pity that great folk should have countenance in this world to drown or hang themselves more than their even Christian, than their fellow Christian, right? Come, my spade, there's no ancient gentleman but gardeners, ditchers, and grave makers. They hold up Adam's profession. Again, think of this in the Euro-Christian. You kind of need to know the Euro-Christian worldview to make sense of these references to Adam. The clown here is saying that we can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And who is Adam? Adam is a gardener, and I'm a grave maker. So I'm among the oldest professions. And why should I, even in this culture where I'm considered lower class, and gentlemen and gentlewomen can get away with still getting a Christian burial even when they've killed themselves? It speaks to the corruptness of money. Yes, it's a class critique, but I think that what Shakespeare is doing is he's able to use class critique in Act 5 and in numerous acts or places in his writing to point out the hypocrisies of Euro-Christian culture. If you flip over to Act 5, Scene 1 of line about 67 here, Hamlet comes in, and he's remarking to Horatio here on these grave diggers, and he says, "That skull had a tongue in it and could sing once. How the knave jowls it to the ground as if toward Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. This might be the pate of a politician, which this ass now over offices, one that would circumvent God, might it or might it not?" And so he's again just the reference to Cain, and I mean of all of the people to reference in the Cain being the first murderer of Abel, right? Cain slays Adam, or Adam and Cain and Abel are Adam's children. Cain slays Adam and gets cast out of Eden. It might, my lord, says Horatio, and Hamlet says, or of a courtier which could say, "Good morrow, sweet lord, how dost thou, good lord?" This might be my lord such a one that praised my lord such a one's horse when I meant to beg it, might it not? And so even Hamlet sort of commenting on sort of death being the leveler of the king and the pauper or the poor person here as well. And we get yet another reference to fortune. So Horatio says, "I, my lord," and Hamlet says, "Why, even so. And now my lady worms chapless and knocked about the mazzard with a sexton's spade. Here's fine revolution, and we had the trick to see it. Did these bones cost no more the breeding to play at loggets with them? Mine ache to think on it." And so when he says, "Here's fine revolution," right, he is referring to a reversal of destiny. He's referring to Fortune's wheel again. Now, Fortune's wheel is being read in a Euro-Christian context, and that goes back to, if you wanted to do some research on it, to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and Boethius was rewritten into English by Geoffrey Chaucer. Did some work there, but we've known throughout various characters referring to Fortune and Fortuna that this idea is at work, and it is a pagan idea, but it's inflected through a Euro-Christian reading. I think another important part of what Fortuna is doing here, and especially Fortune being referred to as a strumpet over and over again, is also coming a little bit from Machiavelli, although he seems to be invoked by Polonius here. We do know that Shakespeare read and knew Machiavelli's work, especially The Prince, which is his famous book on being a courtier, but also on princes holding power. Castiglione's book, The Courtier, also is probably a good reference point here as well. And so there's a lot of other sort of textual lineage, I think, that's being inflected on this scene as well. So while Fortuna historically a pagan concept. It has been very much indicative of I would say, the medieval Euro-Christian worldview. And some of that seems to be changing or being questioned. And we could talk about like what modernity is, and Hamlet sits as a text between medieval or early modern and modern. But Euro-Christian culture sort of persists throughout with some changes. So Fortuna, the idea of Fortuna is that the wheel is going to keep turning, right? Rosencrantz and Guildenstern want to keep in about her middle parts, or they want to keep the balance in power because they want to keep Claudius on top of the wheel of fortune so that they can receive their just, maybe not just, but so that they can get their money for taking Hamlet to be killed. But we realize that Hamlet here tells Horatio in this act how he escaped that fate, how he figured out that he was being sent to his death, and instead rearranged the writing so that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are the ones who are put to death when they get to England. Okay. There is a lot of teasing of tolerance at work here, especially among the clowns and the gravediggers. The clown and the gravedigger, they don't get out of a kind of class-based predicament here, even though they're able to tease the upper classes. And I think that there's a kind of reversal at work with Hamlet as well. No one outwords Hamlet generally throughout the play, except for this gravedigger, right? Who is just doing to Hamlet what Hamlet's been doing to everybody else throughout the play. And Hamlet, some people read Hamlet as having come back from being sent away with this experience with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they see him as having a clear mind in Act 5. And I'm not sure that I always buy that, but I do think that in this moment that the gravedigger who just puns with Hamlet and is making fun of him and seems to have no regard for his nobility is a really nice tension that Shakespeare throws in here. So he is the one character who seems to outpun Hamlet himself. Then we get on this the question of in this kind of back and forth exchange, we get a reference to equivocation, and this is an important concept in Shakespeare's time period, and especially through the Protestant church's break away from the Catholic Church. Because we already know that in 1585 in England it became a capital crime to harbor a Catholic priest, right? So Hamlet is being written about 16 years later, and equivocation still comes up. And there have been these books that were written for Catholics so that they could kind of maintain their Catholic identity without giving too much. They could answer questions posed to them by Protestants that were still truthful enough, but weren't quite all the way truthful. And what that came to be called was equivocating, which then became sort of criminalized itself. So Horatio, this is about line 120 in Act 5, Scene 1. Hamlet, the clown has said that they've been out arguing, like, what is this a man? Is this a woman? And he's saying, no, for none, neither. Who's to be buried in it, says Hamlet. One that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead. And so he's been messing with Hamlet. How absolute the knave is, says Hamlet. We must speak by the card, or equivocation will undo us. And so he's making fun, he's talking to Horatio, making fun of the knave, or peasant, in this case. But he's also making fun of equivocation itself. And I think that there seems to be a bit of a dig at people who were less learned around Christian doctrine in general, people who sort of buy into the law of the time and say, like, equivocator, equivocator, or you're a witch, that this kind of fanaticism that could come out. There's some elitism, I think, that Hamlet is showing here. By the Lord Horatio, these 3 years, I've taken note of it. So I think he's referring to, like, the 3 years here. I think he's been talking about college, being at Wittenberg. These 3 years, I've taken note of it. The age has grown so picked that the toe of the peasant comes so near the heel of the courtier, he galls his kibe. How long hast thou been a gravemaker? He says to the gravemaker. So he galls his kibe. He, like, the peasant has been able, is in such contact with the courtier, the higher up person, that he gives the gall into the pus that goes into sores that goes on someone's heel, right? So it's not a very flattering portrait of peasantry, but it is also speaking to that collapse of fortune's wheel as well. That there's a collapse between high and low as well, and he seems to be annoyed by it at this point. And then there's some discussion about about how long he's been a grave digger, and Hamlet's own life sort of becomes the frame and gets mirrored in the grave digger's life, which is so beautiful here. That's why I didn't refer earlier to the grave digger being a foil for Hamlet, even though he does do this kind of doubling with the word play. I do think that the gravedigger acts as a kind of mirror or a frame, a framed mirror for Hamlet to think back and reflect upon his whole life, which he of course does through mortality in the famous scenes with the skulls here. So Yorick's the clown then makes fun of England and says they're all madmen there. Hamlet's gone away to England. So Hamlet gets a little bit distance from his own self so that he can see himself here. And then Yorick's skull personalizes again the collapse between Fortune's wheel and Hamlet. So he says, "Let me see," and he takes the skull. He says, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of the most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I've kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to settle the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chop-fallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick to this favor. She must come. Make her laugh at that. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one more thing." "What's that, my lord?" And he goes on to say, dost thou think Alexander looked all this fashion in the earth? Even so, says Horatio, and smelt so potty smells, and he's talking about death. Alexander the Great he's talking about, right? And he mentions Caesar, and then a little bit further down here. And so what Yorick has done, this is where I'm saying that he's collapsing Fortune's wheel, is that Yorick, the jester, is being compared now to Alexander the Great and to Julius Caesar, to these great leaders in their day, and death seems to be for all of them. Then we get the funeral procession coming in, and we get the priest who basically says out loud that her death is doubtful. The priest on page 201 says her obsequies or her funeral rites have been as far enlarged as we have warranties. Her death was doubtful, and but that great command oversways the order, she should in the ground unsanctified have lodged till the last trumpet. So even the priest is pretty suspicious of the nobility, saying, no, you will bury Ophelia. It also speaks to some sympathy that the nobility has, and we saw that with Gertrude earlier in Act 4. There is a moment of compassion that people have for Ophelia's death. I mentioned in my last lecture that Ophelia does what Hamlet cannot do, and I think that's the evidence there. Some more textual evidence is that everybody seems to recognize that, right? It's getting a little dark in here, so I'm going to turn this on. So, and of course, this infuriates Laertes, her brother. And Laertes says, layer in the earth, and far and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. Remember that she said she would have given violets in Ophelia's last speech when she's handing out different herbs. And I'll get to those in my end remarks here. But violets here are kind of representing faithfulness, right? And so the violets would spring up from her grave to prove that she was faithful, is what Laertes is saying. I tell thee, churlish priest, a ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling. And this also, the use of the word priest here, I think speaks to a derision from the Anglican Protestant sense, that the priest has no place to know the state of of someone else's soul, but through corrupt practices, through indulgences and things like this that have been widely criticized throughout the Protestant Reformation, that it has created this hostility around priests that Laertes seems to be expressing there. So Hamlet notes here, and I do think that Laertes is a kind of foil for Hamlet. Laertes is a double of Hamlet. Laertes is Hamlet himself will say it. He suffers most of the things that Hamlet himself has suffered, except that Hamlet doesn't lose a sister in the play. So there are lots of questions, I think, around Ophelia's death and this kind of as some critics have characterized it almost this way, as kind of almost like a cockfight between Laertes and Hamlet, as kind of doubles here, and Laertes does seem to be in some ways Hamlet's better, but also in the sense that Laertes is a possible contender for the throne as well. So we know that when he came to find his his father dead, that he was inciting rebellion, and Claudius assuaged him. So it was another place where, if you go back to my reading from Act 4, that I thought that Claudius was maybe not being quite kingly. The question here around Ophelia's death that also comes up is a question around the dead themselves, and are the dead really dead? And I think, as some people have pointed out, in some ways we might see Ophelia as a double for Hamlet's father's ghost. She follows the ghost in a kind of way to death early on. That Ophelia film kind of romantically gives her a way out of death, and so we've seen that kind of fantasy, at least put by other writers onto fan fiction readings of Shakespeare. Um, the queen here says, "Sweet." Hamlet says, "What the fair Ophelia? Sweets to the sweet farewell. I hoped thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not to have strewed thy grave." Now remember way back, like when Laertes was saying, "Oh, Ophelia, don't go with Hamlet. He's a prince out of your star," right? So there was this kind of class thing going on there. But here we have the queen, whether we believe Gertrude or not, here, the queen seems to have thought that that would have been a fine idea. And in fact, Gertrude, throughout the play, I want to mention this because in some depictions, like the Ophelia film that I've been kind of harping on, it depicts a rivalry, like a mother relationship rivalry between Ophelia and Gertrude. There are some psychoanalytic readings that will read them in a mother type of relationship as well. But Gertrude seems to be, she seems to really feel, I read her as authentic here anyway. Laertes, "O trouble, woe, fall 10 times treble on that cursed head whose wicked deed thy most ingenious sense deprived thee of. Hold off the earth a while till I have caught her once more in my arms." And he leaps in the grave. And then he says, "Now pile your dust upon the quick and dead, till of this flat a mountain you have made, toward the top, old Pelion, or the skyish head of blue Olympus, the mountain of the gods in Greek mythology." And Hamlet comes rushing forward here as well. And he says, "What is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane." This is this moment where he really comes forward. Remember I'd said that Wilson Knight in his readings said that it's around Ophelia that Hamlet seems to lose control completely, where there doesn't seem to be method in his madness. That's one of, I think, the cases that he's thinking of here. Laertes, of course, says, "The devil take your soul," and there's this fighting exchange between them, and who could love somebody more? And Hamlet admits that he loved her. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. Now, do we want, like most critics, like many people read Hamlet's harshness to Ophelia? There might be other ways to read what was going on between Hamlet and Ophelia earlier. I tried to suggest that the pregnancy issue was there, in the romanticized rereading or rewriting for the Ophelia film. They present them as having been secretly married. So that's not. I think my reading isn't completely wild in that way. I think people have gone much more wild than I am willing to go with their relationship. The king says, "Oh, he's mad, Laertes. For the love of God, forbear him," says the queen. And this kind of contemplation on death here that Hamlet has by his wounds, right? "Show me what thou wilt do. Would you weep? Would you fight? Would you fast? Would you tear yourself? Would you drink up esil or vinegar? Would you eat a crocodile? I'll do it. Do you come here to whine, to outface me with the leaping in her grave? Be buried quick with her, and so will I. And if thou prate of mountains, let me throw millions of acres on us, till our ground singeing his pate against the burning zone, make Ossa, the mountain by Olympus, like a wart. Nay, on thou'lt mouth I'll rant as well as you." And Hamlet doesn't seem to understand Laertes' anger at Hamlet, right? He says, "Hear you, sir. What is the reason that you've used me thus? I loved you ever, but it is no matter. Let Hercules himself do what he may. The cat will mew and dog will have his day." And then we get this scheming of the king, right? Remember, I've said that Polonius is dead, but now Claudius has taken the part of being the stage director, the intriguer in Act 5 here. So if we go to Act 5, Scene 2, this is where Hamlet recounts to Horatio his escape from the ship. He seems to have learned in a restless dream that he was unsafe. And he calls this providence with a capital P, yet another Euro-Christian term. And why is that important? I think it's important because providence is going to be the way that Euro-Christianity deals with the question of fate or fortune's wheel. The fates, vates or vates in Latin, is what has been spoken. Sometimes it's referred to what Zeus has spoken, and so it is there. But sometimes the fates are also, as I've said, are earlier characters that even the gods can't do anything about the fates, right? So the gods can pity Oedipus when Oedipus dies, because they're like, wow, that was really harsh. There's nothing anybody could do about it. And yet we've had this contemplation throughout the play, this running dialogue on Fortuna, call out Fortuna for being unjust when it comes to Hecuba, when it comes to Dido, when it comes to Ophelia, right? So Ophelia is layered into all of these older women characters. That's part of what she's doing here. And I think to just limit her a little bit too much to just a character of this play, I think limits what I think Hamlet is doing with this as a tragedy. So he has this dream, and he calls it Providence. This and the pirate's entrance that seems to gets depicted sometimes as well. I think it's in the Branagh film. There's a little depiction of this. It's sometimes referred to as the Deus ex machina, or the ghost in the machine, or the ghost in the hand. And this means that God's will, that there's something outside of the events of the actions of the players that changes the entire plot of the play. So in a way you see it as like coming from outside, and you could call it the writer's will, but at least the way that when we just look at the play itself, it seems like God has intervened. Famously in Carl Schmitt's political theology book, he says that the miracle is that the state of exception in law, and the state of exception is decided by the sovereign, who decides when we're in a state of exception, when laws break down. He says that the state of exception in law is equivalent to the miracle in theology. So there is something miraculous about what is going on, what happens with Hamlet as he returns from the boats. So he says he searched Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's things and found instructions for his execution in England. He rewrites and reseals the commission to execute Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He mimics statesmen to do so. So that's important, how he mimics the language in his writing. Hamlet, as I've said, bears no ill will to Laertes. The messenger Osric invites Hamlet to the duel, which is framed as a wager between Claudius and Laertes. Hamlet accepts and tells Horatio that he's actually likely to win. So Horatio says, no, don't do that. And he says, oh, actually, I'll win. But then he says, again, Providence is mentioned. There's a special, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Like, my death is out of my own hand. I will leave it up to fate. But he says there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow at line 200 in Act 5, Scene 2. So he seems to accept peacefully his fate. There's also a passage in Matthew in the Bible on sparrows. I believe it's in the book of Matthew. I might have to look it up. You can look it up. Quick Google search if you want. that has to do with that if two sparrows are let go, not one of them will die or fall to the ground without God having a hand in the least, like in every death, right? So that's the reference here. Again, that's a more subtle Euro-Christian reference, but it makes more sense when you see the biblical allusion and this idea of providence. Providence is being mentioned multiple times, and I think it's important in Act 5, especially in relation to Fortuna throughout the rest of the play. Hamlet apologizes and seems to make peace with Laertes. I don't think Laertes at first believes him, but he takes his hand anyway. Hamlet blames it on his madness. He has this. He says, if I was mean to you, it wasn't me, I wasn't myself, and so he has this kind of displacement. There's a kind of chivalry going on between Hamlet and Laertes in this scene as knights, and we will see a doubling of this kind of chivalry element, I think, between Thomas Mowbray and Bolingbroke when we get to Richard II. After this, chivalry plays a big part. Yes, I think that courtly love culture, that Shakespeare has been satirizing that, and we saw that in Midsummer Night's Dream, so I wouldn't put a high degree of emphasis on chivalry here, but nevertheless there is a kind of bonding that Laertes and Hamlet do in this final scene here. Hamlet, at least to me, here reads as authentically humble in relation to Laertes. That's something you can agree with me with or disagree with me on. Laertes thinks that Hamlet is mocking him as well, and we've seen that kind of structure again show up in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the dream has been lifted, the veil has been lifted, and not everybody is willing. Is quite willing to believe. There's more wonderment, even within the dream in A Midsummer Night's Dream, when the two guys, paramours, are chasing, are cockfighting, in the forest. There's disbelief going on. So. Hamlet is being intentionally self-deprecating here. He already told he's says, oh, I might not win, but he already told Horatio we know that he will win. So in the death here, I just want you to note that Horatio calls himself more a Roman than a Dane, and he's alluding to the honorable death over dishonor. I think that this is also it's probably a reference to Stoicism here. Horatio wants to be the antique Roman, but Hamlet passes on the charge of remembrance from his own father to Horatio. So actually there's something that Hamlet does here with Horatio, like the honorable death is the one who goes toward it fearlessly, which I think is like why a heroic reading could read Ophelia's death as being kind of Romanesque in this particular way, and why I think it's well, yes, she is a victim in many ways in the text, a victim of circumstance, a victim of gender conventions. There's a way that the text is also presenting her as something virtuous and true in that particular, in the way that she dies. Whether we want to believe that that's a good way to go, we can argue with that, but I just think it's in the text. It would also kind of allude, I think, to Socrates' death, or in the Apology in Plato against the state of Athens. But it's actually, again, so if you know the story of Socrates' death, he's been condemned, he's like been offered exile, but instead he chooses death. He says, no, I'm going to accept the laws of the state as it exists. And even all of his friends are lamenting with him as he's taking the hemlock poison. Again, Hamlet is not the Roman here, and I think this is why modernists want to read him as, foreshadowing modernity in this particular way, and Horatio is kind of standing up in this other way, even though Horatio outlives him here. But again, I think that Ophelia is the one who goes to her death rather in that way of Socrates, that there's at least a possibility of reading her death as not just being from lunacy. And then, of course, Fortinbras comes in, and we get the line, what warlike noise is this? Fortinbras has Hamlet's dying voice. The rest is silence, and the four O's, oh, 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 oh. And so, yes, many critics have mentioned that the rest is not actually silence, it's this kind of groaning. Fortinbras then instructs to bear Hamlet like a soldier who would have proved worthy as a royal leader. Now, one question that I think I will leave you with as I get done with the reading here before I jump over into some interpretation is justice done in Hamlet? And at first you might just think, if this has been a bloodbath, the queen is dead, the king is dead. Many people question whether or not Gertrude was in part guilty. Of course, we know that Hamlet conflates her as being a conspirator with Claudius in her bedchamber, but he's not really in a lot of mental control at that moment. So whether or not Gertrude is guilty or Gertrude's guilt is going to be a big thing, something that Carl Schmitt makes a big deal of in his book Hamlet or Hecuba. So the king is dead, the prince is dead, Laertes is dead, the queen is dead, Ophelia is dead, and so the entire sort of possibility of successors to the crown, if we can think about it in that way, are completely wiped out at this point. Now, if you think back to Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy, where you have a wronged leader who has been killed, and you have revenge who's personified in that play, what we see is something similar, where we work up to this kind of bloodbath at the end, except that what Hamlet does a little bit different is that at the end of Spanish tragedy, there's still a Spanish king, but Hamlet kind of one-ups the whole thing and just wipes out everybody in the court. So there, I think that that's something that for the Elizabethan / early Jamesian Jacobite audience, or Jacobean audience, I think that would have been like the spectacle of the tragedy there, like the kind of jaw drop is this Act 5. And Fortinbras comes in, and this is this other statesman, and we know that he's been hovering in the wings since Act 1. So I just think that it's worth pondering on justice, since tragedies, especially in the ancient Greek sense, were meant to bring back into order. Is Shakespeare in his tragedy saying that this is how order is restored? Or is order restored, or is it just going to be another bloodbath or something? It's just an open thing to be thinking about. In ancient Greek tragedies, the voice of justice in the community is the chorus. Shakespeare doesn't use a chorus of voices that's set in his plays, but you might try and think about where does the voice of conscience, the voice of justice sort of work here? And I mentioned that term conscience. This is like a particular key word in Hamlet, right? Because it seems to have moved internally. Euro-Christian culture seems to move justice into this internal sort of space, the space that Hamlet has that passes show, right? And then, well, part of the question there is, like, with that movement towards the internality, where is justice? Where is external justice? Is everything else just a show? Including the king and kingly succession. Is the king with his body, or is he with Polonius under the stairs? Okay. There's no way to exhaust the play, so I'm going to pause there. If you're just watching these videos for the readings of the plays, that ends my contextualized reading. I did promise some students that I would address some psychoanalysis and some gendered stuff around Ophelia. And the way I'm going to do it is through this book called Stay Illusion, the Hamlet Doctrine, by Jamieson Weber and her husband, Simon Critchley. And Simon Critchley, if you don't know, is a very famous, well-known philosopher. His Webster, who's married to him, is a psychoanalyst and has several books as well. This came out in 2013, and the press is Pantheon Press. So I'm gonna use them just because I want to get more critical voices into your heads here, and also because I think that what Webster, sorry, Simon Critchley, but like I think I'm gonna attribute a little bit more of the psychoanalysis stuff to Webster, so I'll just use Webster as the main author here, because I think some of the background knowledge in psychoanalysis is coming from her. So one of the things Webster does in this book is she digs back into Freud's letters. And what I think, my students are oftentimes intrigued. They're like, oh, I want to learn about psychoanalysis and Shakespeare, especially psychoanalysis and Hamlet, because so much has been done. And what we see is that as Freud is developing his theory of psychoanalysis, he's directly referring in his letters to the play itself. And he has a friend of his that he's writing letters to, Fleiss. So he has Wilhelm Fleiss, who is sometimes like, he's not the inventor of psychoanalysis, but he seems to have been acting as a kind of analyst for Freud as Freud was developing his ideas. And then there's a break that Freud has with him, and he wanted his letters destroyed, but his letters didn't get destroyed, and so we thankfully we have them. And he really wants, as Webster points out, he really wants, he connects the Oedipal relationship and the play Hamlet. Both of them are at the foundation for Freud's thinking in psychoanalysis. And this is young Freud. This is not famous Freud. This is a Freud who's ambitious, who really wants to become famous. He thinks he has this big theory, and he's trying to articulate it to other people as well. So this is a really nice thing that this book does in part 2 of the book. In a chapter called I Have Bad Dreams, we get a little bit, this is a really kind of short way of thinking about connecting Hamlet and the Oedipal complex. So Webster says, Hamlet, Freud says, can do anything but punish the man who has killed his father and taken his mother, taken his place with his mother. In other words, the man who has done what he wished to do as a child. What we find instead is that the reproaches against Claudius are turned into self-reproaches, which remind him that he is literally no better than his murdering stepfather. Freud adds that a bitter distaste for sexuality erupts in his relations with Ophelia. This is Freud writing. Freud says, an Oedipus, the child's wishful fantasy, is brought into the open and realized as it would be in the dream. In Hamlet, it remains repressed. And just as in the case of a neurosis, we only learn of its existence from its inhibiting consequences. So at least Freud seems to be reading in this moment here the relationship with Ophelia as repressed sexuality. I don't know that that's like a consistent reading. It doesn't jive necessarily with things I've said in some of my own earlier lectures, but who am I compared to Freud? But okay, so the Oedipal drama, right? It's not so much about like wanting to marry your mother or like have sex with your mother and marry your father, right? It is the Oedipal story is mapped onto the development of the id and the superego, and the ego, right, or the unconscious structure. And what happens is through the development of identity or the ego, the I, there's a separation of the I from the mother or the mother's breast. The brother's breast is just a metaphor for life. It's what allows you to live, allows you to eat, and it's where you get warmth and affection. There's an interruption of that from other events in the world, but the way that Freud genders it within his nuclear family Euro structure in Austria at the time is through the father. So the father interrupts the kind of love that the fixation that the child might have, wants to have mom all to him or herself, but the father is a third who interrupts that. The father is a powerful third that the child can have no power over, and so there's this kind of development of resentment, and then that the father's power eventually gets internalized and sublimated and becomes law. That becomes superego, or over time and over generations it becomes capital L law and morality, social custom, and convention. Now that's taking a little bit further from Freud's thinking from Totem and Taboo, where he deals with Hamlet as well. And Totem and Taboo is about, 15 years or so after Interpretation of Dreams. So just in Freud's own writing there as well. What he's doing, of course, is he tries to map, and this is what I've called the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, fantasy with a PH. He tries to map the development of humankind onto the internal development of an individual's being. This was a common type of practice that was done throughout. It's kind of considered pseudoscience, of course. That what the embryo does, it goes through is as we're developing in utero, we go through the earlier phases of evolution. So if humans were once fish, the fetus kind of looks like a fish for a while, and then it grows a tail, it looks like a tadpole, and all these sorts of things. And there's like, you can see why, like, especially because we have regressive traits that show up on our bodies. Like Freud is looking for a biological explanation. He's trying to deal with Darwin and stuff. So you can see why he might have made the mistake. I'm not meaning to apologize for Freud here, but it might sound so wacky, what he's talking. I don't think it's as wacky in the context, in his cultural context, to be thinking some of these things. And so what Freud is trying to do is he's trying to show how over time, when he maps onto the Euro-Christian fantasy structure of civilization and the development in our own brains, that this is how law and civilization and morality sort of get built in us. And he will be dealing with that kind of more cultural criticism stuff all the way up to late books like Civilization and Its Discontents, which is around 1930. That's one of his later books. So Webster says here, the enigma of Hamlet is for Freud only more evidence for his theory. In other words, evidence of repression, a division within consciousness that expresses itself in the division within criticism. Hamlet is the neurotic subject par excellence. So as he's coming up with his theory of psychoanalysis and what the human brain does, he says that the brain has this repressive tendency. It takes the object of desire that we want, fundamentally the mother's breast, that says that when we cannot get it, we sublimate that, we push it under to our unconscious, and we find other things that substitute for it. I can't get my mom's attention, and I want it because, my older brother or my dad, whoever is competing with me for it. And so, I watch TV, I watch Teletubbies, I get light up shoes, I get other friends, and eventually we build a complex symbology of things that substitute for primal desires that we have. Now, this kind of thinking in psychology, and I can tell you because I have seen an analyst recently, still deals with some of these thoughts, even though I don't go to a Freudian analyst. And so for those of you who are in psychology classes or taking your psych majors, you might see that some of this stuff is still relevant, even though Freud himself has been severely criticized and rightfully criticized for many things. He's also been severely misunderstood and misread, and I'll give him that as well. So in the interpretation of dreams, which just comes around, it's like, I think it is like 1899, 1900, like right around the turn of the century. In the interpretation of dreams, he deals with Hamlet early on. So we see that. So even though we didn't have his private letters till like about 1985 published, where we see that he was really thinking of Hamlet when he was coming up with the theory of psychoanalysis, even early on, he's dealing with Hamlet and the interpretation of dreams. And so this is a quote from Interpretation of Dreams that's in Webster's book here. Dreams, Freud says, dreams then are often most profound when they seem most crazy. In every epoch of history, those who've had something to say but could not say it without peril have eagerly assumed a fool's cap. The audience at whom their forbidden speech was aimed tolerated it more easily if they could at the same time laugh and flatter themselves with the reflection that the unwelcome words were clearly nonsensical. You can think about what Ophelia does with her nonsensical words, that when you break them down, they're quite critical, right? The prince in the play, that's Hamlet, right? Who had to disguise himself as a madman, was behaving just as dreams do in reality. So that we can say of dreams what Hamlet said of himself, concealing the true circumstances under a cloak of wit and unintelligibility. I am but mad northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw. End quote. That's all in Freud in Interpretation of Dreams. So if you're dealing with dreams in final papers and research papers, that's a really good place. There are various places in Freud, and you will not have time to read all of Freud this during our semester, but that's a good grounding place. Couple of other things, just these are mostly passages that I mentioned in Webster and Critchley's book here. So one thing that he remarks, because people bring up gender around Freud, rightly so. Yes, we know he didn't get gender right. It's I'm not meaning to poo-poo the critique. It's just that the critique is really well known, and sometimes people come in and they're like, well, he didn't get this right. It's like, yeah, we've known that for a really long time. So Freud himself told Princess Bonaparte, who's the woman who had these letters and refused to Wilhelm Fleiss, and she refused to destroy them. He stated to Princess Bonaparte, the great question that has never been answered and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is what does a woman want? So there you are. At least there's like some element of Freud where he's like, I just don't get it. Okay. in a paper on narcissism and introduction. So Hamlet is a melancholic, but he's also a narcissist, and I want to get to melancholy in a second here. Again, this is through Jameson Webster. I'm indebted to her and Simon Critchley here. They break it. Freud breaks it down into 4 points in his paper on narcissism and introduction. Narcissistic love is first a love that sees the other as what one is. So I see myself in the other, and that's what I love about them, is I see me, what I used to be. So I see something in the other person that reminds me of who I was when I was younger, what I would like to be in the future, or someone other than who this loved one is, someone who is already a part of oneself. So I recognize that this person is different from me, but I've already narcissistically enveloped them into my own world, and so what I love is how they're different from me in a way that I can sort of control within my own. So those, and then he contrasts that with a different kind of love. By contrast, they say love that exceeds narcissism does not raise self-regard. It doesn't think of my own self-preservation. And that rather leads, for Freud, it leads to humility and an expenditure of desire. So Freud writes, the effect of the dependence upon the loved object is to lower that feeling. A person in love in this regard is humble. A person who loves has, so to speak, forfeited a part of his narcissism. And so there has to be a kind of, maybe there's not one or the other, but there maybe needs to be a balance between the narcissistic love and the humbling love, right? Because I think if you extended out the humbling love, then it would refract back into a different kind of narcissism as well, or into a kind of like, I will just die for the other, which can be easily read as narcissistic. Webster and Critchley write in this book a nice passage. They're reflecting on our current moment, and they say, in a civilization defined by endless, exhausting, and atomizing experience of labor, in which each person has a price in the form of a wage, how much we make a year, right? Where our time is never our own, mourning offers a unique experience where we work on our own time, where we take the time that we need. And this is what Hamlet is, of course, doing from the beginning of the play. He's mourning the loss of his father. He's being critiqued by Claudius for not being manly. And so that's something as well. So that he's all sorts of readings of Hamlet as being kind of effeminate, intellectual, doesn't want to be a strong warrior, although he appears to be okay with his sword fighting as well. So he is a melancholic disposition. We've talked about that in earlier lectures. He's inhibited and unable to love, though, because he's so melancholic. This is a passage from Jacques Lacan, who becomes Freud's successor in Paris, and is an important psychoanalyst in his own regard. He says on the Oedipal complex that Freud replies, as always, without the slightest precaution. He bowls us over, and thank God he did it till the day he died, for otherwise he never could have finished what he still had to lay out in his field of work. Freud replies that it's the aftermath of the Oedipus complex, a narcissistic demand made by the subject. And what I think Lacan is getting at here, and what Webster and Critchley point out in their book, is that Lacan kind of did this too, is that, like, we know very well that Freud made all sorts of mistakes, but because he pushed so far, what Lacan is saying is, like, because he pushed so far and he made all these mistakes, he laid the groundwork for what psychoanalysis could be. In Civilization and Its Discontents, they write, Freud writes that it's not possible. It is not the hubris of the Oedipal desire that is the problem. Um, so we tend to think, and I think a lot of Freudian psychologists thought of this in years after, especially in American interpretations, which are really different than the European ones. They saw the Oedipal complex as the problem to be worked through. But Freud didn't actually see it that way. Freud said that we could never really completely resolve the Oedipal complex, but it was worth it to understand its structure to work through how repression and regressive memories might work, so that we can deal with it in analysis. So we don't ever get cured necessarily. And this is something that Lacan would take up especially as well too, that there's no such thing necessarily as a cure. Which is like people don't want to hear, and this is why behaviorism or behavioral psychology or taking pills, I think, has become so much of the culture in the United States, because it's quantifiable in certain sorts of ways. So we can take pills. I'm not necessarily completely against all of that, and I have my own work on psychedelic aesthetics, and there's a rich discussion to be had in the psychedelic renaissance around these issues that's just not relevant here. But I should just traditionally in the United States, there has been a divide, and I think between the coasts and the Midwest. So I'm talking from Denver, and I think that analysis in the Freudian sense, while you can do it in Denver, and I once saw one, so people still do Freudian analysis here. I think it thrives more on the coasts than maybe it does in the middle of the country, and we definitely have like a prescribe an SSRI culture, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right, or antidepressants, Prozac, things like that. Lots to be said about that. I'll keep talking if I don't come back to the text here. So what Freud is saying, and what Lacan I think takes to the more extreme, is that we don't necessarily get cured. It's not about a cure. The talking cure, which is another name for psychoanalysis, doesn't cure us. It gives us an ongoing way or methods to interpret and deal with life and life circumstances as they come, by dealing with our memory, by dealing with our trauma. And so what they say here is the problem, Freud says, in civilization and its discontents is not the problem of the Oedipal complex, it's the hubris of happiness. It's that our culture tells us all the time that we ought to be happy. All the time. Why aren't you? What's wrong with you? Why aren't you happy? Our culture keeps telling us, our culture is kind of like Claudius and Gertrude in Act 1. And it gives us this ideal for happiness that we never achieve. And because we never achieve it, and it's been set up as an ideal, which is kind of a false ideal, we're always going to fail at becoming fully happy. So we're kind of screwed from the beginning. This is like Freud's dark reading of culture towards the end of his life. And I think rightly so. As a Jew who has had to flee Europe at this point, the Nazis, he would have died if he had stayed in Vienna, for sure. So I think that within his cultural critique, there's a big critique of National Socialism that's on his mind. Freud and late Freud. Freud says that everyone must find out in what particular fashion he can be saved. So at the same time, there is, and I think that there's this persists throughout Freudian influenced psychology today, is there is this fixation on the trauma or the traumatic event. What happened in your childhood, right? Even people who are anti-Freudian or don't deal with Freud directly, still deal with that kind of impulse. And I would say that that's part of Euro-Christian culture. So even though Freud is a Jew, and I just mentioned that he's critiquing the society as somebody who's being persecuted as a Jew. So I'm not trying to take away Freud's Jewishness, but he is also working in this Western Euro-Christian tradition. And it is a question that where individuals need to be saved in one way or another. My Native American friends, an indigenous critique of this would be that is what Euro-Christian culture is. It takes itself for being universal to all of humanity. It maps that savior complex onto cultures around the world. And then, even when it's traumatized other cultures, when it's genocided indigenous cultures, it then seeks to provide the remedy through things like Freudian psychology, or through subjecting indigenous peoples to a European or Euro-Christian fantasy structure. And that is what perpetuates genocide today. That's one of the things that perpetuates genocide against indigenous peoples today. And that's why, that seems like a bit of an extreme example here, but when we read and universalize someone like Shakespeare for his humanitarian tendencies, if we read too quickly Hamlet into the Freudian versions of Hamlet, and Freud has this savior complex that he wants to map on to Hamlet, then we're doing something Euro-Christian. Now, you may not believe me right now, but I do want to emphasize this. And lots of critics, and Wilson Knight, who I mentioned in another lecture video, lots and lots of critics have seen Hamlet as a kind of Christ figure, and that might kind of mess with your head at first, but you have to dig into some of the criticism to see how this works. Even when Wilson Knight saw Hamlet as a kind of overman or superman, and I said that this might have been a critique of National Socialism, even in a later essay, which is in his book Wheel of Fire. If you get the book came out in 1930, but there's an essay at the end from 1946 where he's trying to reconcile Hamlet as being this kind of overman character in Nietzsche's sense, in a sense that's not the National Socialist or the Nazi sense. And so Nietzsche's sister was a kind of proto-Nazi, and she was married to a guy, and they selected some of Nietzsche's stuff, and that went on to influence Nazis. This isn't to be a defense of Nietzsche's philosophy either. You have to dig more into it than I can cover right now, but he becomes an important reader of Hamlet as well in The Birth of Tragedy. So that's another place to look for interpretations of Hamlet. Webster and Critchley deal with it in the Hamlet Doctrine. I'm not going to talk about it here, but they deal with it in part 3. Just maybe a couple more things. So Hamlet is a melancholic. It's because Hamlet is in mourning that structures the delay of the play. Hamlet is in mourning, and he has arrested development. Now, you can read him as being stuck in the Oedipal complex. That's one way you can read him, and many people do. And many people sexualize his relationship between himself and Gertrude, for example. That's been done as well. That takes kind of a more extreme version of Freudian analysis and tries to externalize it into a production of the play itself. But if we think about melancholia, there's a nice description that Webster gives us here on page 135 in her book. Classically, melancholia is situated under the category called narcissistic neuroses, meaning it is grouped together with the psychoses, the obvious culprit, what we now commonly call schizophrenia. Indeed, melancholia can lead to psychosis. And so psychosis is when you can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy, right? That's a psychotic break. Indeed, melancholia can lead to psychosis, and its structure is more problematically narcissistic than the neuroses proper: hysteria, anxiety, or anxiety, hysteria, the obsessional, and the phobia. And so melancholia might be similar to those, but because it fixes on one's own self. And so this is definitely what Hamlet does I would say in Soliloquy 2 especially, where he's berating himself over talking, like, and he does it throughout the play, but he's just like, what a fool am I, I'm such an idiot, that kind of thing. It's a kind of depressive state that is also very narcissistic in that it just keeps pointing out itself. And maybe you've known people like this. Maybe you've been a person like this who, after a while, like, it's not just like the boy who cries wolf syndrome, but it's just like after a while when somebody is just so obsessed with themselves and their depression, they become really difficult to talk to, right? Because it's just like it's the them show the entire time. And of course that can become a strategy for the melancholic to make it more and more the them show so that people go away from them, right? So there's lots of complexities there. Let's see. I want to switch over. So there's a lot to be thinking about in terms of Freud. I think that I've connected the Oedipal complex and Freud, and I've talked about the historical context that Freud is developing his theory of psychoanalysis through the play Hamlet. It's not that we use psychoanalysis to interpret Hamlet. It's actually like Hamlet informs what Freud meant by psychoanalysis. That's a really important thing to think about historically. Let's shift over to Ophelia before I end today, because some people wanted, I do think a way through my course is, one of the themes you might deal with are women in Shakespeare, right? And many students want to deal with this, which is fine. So let's look at Ophelia. Again, I'm going to use Webster and Critchley to get their perspectives in here as well. They say Ophelia is the embodiment of fierce femininity, the rock of love and the bedrock of castration, and as such, she is the true casualty of the tragedy. It is from her that the real threat emanates. If Hamlet's identification with Laertes serves as an opening onto desire, pretty Ophelia is in the reverse position. She acts in her life as a pure obstacle. Now, remember back to my Act 4 discussion where I was saying that Ophelia does what Hamlet could not. And it can seem like a little bit of an over-heroic reading of Hamlet, but it sort of jives with what they're saying here. I'm going to keep reading here. Not only Hamlet, in fact, but most of the other characters in the play, Polonius, Laertes, and also the king and queen, dismiss Ophelia as someone who possesses her own desire. She's always taken as something to be used, as bait. No one ever asks her what she really wants. They just assume that it's already that she has everything that she wants. In her madness, we see her desire explode onto the stage, immersed in a voracious sexuality invariably denied to her. From this, she slips into the river and dies. The scene is described through her clothing, mermaid-like and incapable of her own distress. Her dress becomes heavy with drink. In this play, we are never very far from the dimension of orality, which we are beginning to suspect is why it has Lacan biting the carpet. So Lacan, in a famous phrase, said that the play is just so inexhaustible, it turns you over, throws you on the floor as a reader so that you're biting the carpet. It's an image he used. Nowhere is the play more orally violent than in the encounter between Hamlet and his women. And nowhere is the play more sexual than with Ophelia's mad sing-song language of plants and flowers, a language of desire that becomes the scene of her death on the riverbank, merging with her image on the surface of the water. So I'm going to keep reading here just because I think that it's important for people writing papers and thinking about gender. I purposely did not do an analysis of the flowers in Act 4 because I wanted to get to this, because they do it so nicely. So they say, Ophelia reaching for long purples, which liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. Surrounded by nature, its pedant boughs, her weedy trophies, tumbles down into the weeping brook and drowns. With an eerie equivalence between death, the phallus, and the potent, flushing sexual vitality of Flora, Ophelia dies on a bed of flowers, like Hamlet's father in the dumb show. While the flowers she bestows upon herself seem to bear on the concealment of her sexuality, long purples associated with the male member, and daisies with dissembling, the others are given in theirs in kind. Now remember, I mentioned that there's perhaps imagery or suggestions that she has conceived throughout the play. I think there's again that kind of conception language going on between the symbology with the flowers that she takes with her into the water. That's what I'm referring to. Laertes, they say, is given rosemary and pansies for remembrance and thoughts, respectively. Gertrude is given fennel and columbines associated with unfaithfulness. Claudius is also given daisies as well as rue, or herb of grace, O Sundays, for repentance and sabbatical virtue. She says that he must wear them with a difference, in line with Claudius's lesser place in the family lineage. Ophelia would have given him violets. Remember, they represent faith. She would have given him violets denoting faithfulness, but they withered all when her father died. She speaks the truth through Flora, the pure pain of desire with no mediation. The flower's organs are all on the outside. But the flower's organs are both male and female, as they go on to talk about in the play in this passage as well. They say that at the end of their passage on Ophelia, that Ophelia's grief produces her acts of madness, and she follows her desire all the way to her death. Ophelia is the Antigone within Hamlet. I won't go into Antigone. She's an ancient Greek figure, just for time right now. Arguably, Ophelia is not just the main casualty in Hamlet, but its true tragic hero. Again, if you refer back to my earlier video, that's what I was getting at. I actually hadn't read this passage of the book yet when I made that video, so I'm happy that I made this because I think it helps me articulate what I was thinking, and I think that they're actually, thank you to Webster and Critchley. I think that you're a little bit more articulate than maybe I was in my earlier video. So just a couple more passages that I think are great. So on page 153, they say Ophelia is a lesson on the dangers of desire. And it is precisely for this desire that she's impugned, reduced to an object, told that her love is a commodity that she must let her father broker, lest her value be downgraded. And then they give a long gloss on Shakespeare and money and desire and love desire, and we'll see that in the sonnets as well. We've already seen it by the time you watch this video. And then one more thing, just as I end here, I've mentioned several times in my contextualized lectures how Ophelia is not just Ophelia in the play, and I really want to resist just victimizing her. And I really want to see her, even though we could argue that these other women are victims in their own right as well. Dido, Hecuba, and Niobe in this passage as well. They all show up in the play. But I think that there's something more that Shakespeare's doing by aligning her with these other women of fate. Now, Freud famously said that myths, I can't remember where he says this, myths are the dreams of nations, right? If we have individual dreams that we're working out as well, and that the crazier dreams that we have are the ones that are speaking to deeper things, like I mentioned earlier. Myths are the dreams of nations, and so that's partly why where he will connect his own readings of of Oedipus and Hamlet. So he tended to read Hamlet as a myth for modernity. We know where it comes from, like this one Shakespeare play, but we don't have the version of Hamlet, right? We know that there are earlier versions, that it was a well-known story. So at the end, this is on page 157 in their book, Polonius, they say Polonius is Ophelia's guardian pimp, protecting his investment and his bloodline through securing her virginity. This transaction in Shakespeare is always tragic. Ophelia herself is explicitly tied to 3 women from antiquity: Hecuba, Niobe, and Jephthah's nameless daughter. So remember back when Hamlet named Polonius Jephthah, who gets sacrificed in the Old Testament. I would add to that Dido, though. I think Dido, I've mentioned that in my earlier gloss on Act 2. These women, while being images of fecundity and objects of barter, reverse into the image of the abject and bereft, shown lacking all they supposedly possessed, left weeping infinite tears. Hecuba is sold into slavery, unable to produce any more sons after the war that took her children and her husband's life. Niobe is punished for pride and her fecundity. All her children are slaughtered, and weeps even after having been turned into stone. And Jephthah's daughter must be sacrificed by her father in a vow he made to God, and is given to 2 months to mourn for the life she will never have, the children she will never bear, the love that will meet no fruition. Ophelia is, as we know, goes mad, which, if we translate into the money of love, means she's worthless. Her only option in this language of exchange is suicide. She declares herself bankrupt and expires. I will add, so Dido is not mentioned in there, and I do think that for the right paper, for the right person thinking about the ways that Hamlet is being in some ways implicitly compared to Aeneas, who has rejected Dido. That's what gets referred to earlier in the play. It's what frames the discussion between the passage that when Hamlet is asking the player one to reperform the Hecuba context, he frames it in terms of the speech to Dido from Aeneas to Dido, and Aeneas is going to ditch Dido. He's her lover, and then he leaves her instead, and then she has this wailing, and there's both of them are echoing this language of calling out fortune itself. And maybe I'm the person who needs to write this paper or something, but I just want to point out that Dido has been left out there, and I think that Dido as a figure is a very, very powerful woman, no matter how tragic she is. In the Aeneid, and Shakespeare would know this, if you read the Aeneid, the chapter on Dido is one of the most powerful chapters in I think literary history. And so there is probably more to be said in that regard, and especially to draw that down throughout the generations and see Ophelia in relation to that. I'm going to go ahead and end there, but I hopefully have given a little bit more gender context around Ophelia, given some people some stuff to work with, and definitely I gave a lot on psychoanalysis. I can continue with some of the gendered readings throughout Richard II and The Tempest as we keep going through. Thanks very much for your attention as usual. I hope that you found this useful, and feel free to write me with questions if you have them.